Good evening, everyone. If we haven't met before, my name is Sydney Kraviak, and I work here at the library. I'm full-time arranging programs for adults like you guys. So thanks for being here tonight and giving me some job security. I appreciate what you all do here for the library. Backed by popular demand is Todd DePastino. We were talking, he hasn't been here since before the pandemic. So it's been a while, but before I hand things over to him, I just few housekeeping things and let you know about some other upcoming programs that might be of interest to you. The library does close at 8 p.m. If you need to use the restrooms, they are out these doors across the hall from us. Some other local or history-ish programs we have coming up is in September, we will have someone here to talk about the Nazi sabotage attempt on the the Horseshoe Curve Railroad in Pennsylvania. So the person who does those presentations gives them in character. So he is a retired U.S. Marine who will be dressed up as a period railroad conductor to tell you about the history of it. So be on the lookout for that. In addition,
what is his name? I don't know.
Kenneth.
Okay.
I'll have to go back and look. I know it's Gunnery. And Kenneth, okay. Yes, he's going to be sergeant. And then this fall in November, December, we're going to be having some World War I themed programs looking back at World War I, including Todd coming back in December to talk about the 1914 Christmas truce. And then after that, we're working with Glenn, who was here last month. Yeah, last month to talk about Masters of the Air World War II air campaign in Europe. And we are working together to plan a Pearl Harbor program. So be on the lookout for that for December as well. So without further ado, Todd DePastino is founder and executive director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, a nonprofit dedicated to sharing veterans stories with the public. He is the author of the award-winning BILL MAULDIN, A Life Up Front, and 6 other books. He has a Ph.D. in American history from Yale University and lectures widely on American history topics. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you. Coming out from this, Peters Township Library sets the standard for events like this. I give a lot of talks throughout the region. I'm from Mount Lebanon. I love living in Mount Lebanon, but anybody here from the library in Mount Lebanon? Okay, I can be honest, they don't do events that are like anything near as well attended and well promoted. And there's usually some accompanying, artifacts, and it's just a lot of value when you come to Peters Township Library. And I feel privileged to be invited, and I have been here for several years, so thank you for being here. I'm a historian. That's how I was trained. I spent many years teaching and writing history. Now I direct this nonprofit that I founded in 2008, Veterans Breakfast Club, and I always like to show off some of our veterans. And we have a World War II veteran here who turns 100 years old. You are not old enough to remember the Whiskey Rebellion, correct? Would you mind telling some people a little bit about your service, just because it is distinct? When you were 16, you were blinded in your right eye. Most people would think that would make you ineligible for the Army, right? But that was not the case.
You're correct. When I was 18, senior in high school, 2 weeks to go to graduation, I was sworn into the Army. And they let me finish school and graduate. And that's how it was back then, And can I tell the story?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, anyway, Todd forced me to tell a couple of stories. First of all, how I found out there's no privacy in the Army. When I got off the train at Fort Meade, my first assignment where I reported to the Army. And, actually, so I had to go to the restroom. So I asked to go to the men's room. So I was directed. I walk in the men's room. They're 6, 8 tall out in the open. nothing but clean up this. I look around, what do I do? And so a sergeant who was assigned there, he came in with his dog. And the dog went over right away and started licking water out of one of the toilets. And the sergeant used the bathroom just like, and so I found out there's no privacy because from then on,
That's how it was.
you go to a barracks with 30, 40 men in the same room. So that was my first two lessons. No privacy. Well, that's my first lesson. The second one was I went to Camp Lee, which was a quartermaster training center. And the first couple of days there, they gave us a slip paper, asked you, what would you like to be in the Army? So, like truck driver, cook, shoemaker, all kind of activities. Well, I had no experience in anything, but I did have a driver's license. So I thought, well, I put on truck driver. Well, the guy alongside of me, he's about 40 years old. He was at the other end of the age that was being drafted. And he was a cook. He owned a restaurant. And of course, he put on cook. Well, I bet I'll give you one guess. Yeah. Who became a cook and he became a truck driver? So that was my second lesson. And then I'll jump to the very end. I was accused in the last couple months of my career in the Army, 3 years, of causing more casualties than the enemy. When I got out of the Cooks and Baker School, I was sent to San Francisco to be in a postal outfit. And that lasted a little while, and then I ended up in a college program at the, I'll call it the order of my captain. He got me to sign up for this program. And I went to college for the Baylor University to learn to be an engineer. Well, 2 months into the course, it was a regular actually a college program, and the Army found out they needed infantrymen more than they needed cooks or what have you. Army engineers. So they canceled the whole college program and put everybody, almost with an odd exception, into the infantry. And I ended up in the 99th Division and Company B, 393rd Regiment. Well, I trained, I had no other choice in the matter. And about 6 weeks, I learned all this later on. About 6 weeks after, 6 weeks before the division went overseas, I got a call to go to the orderly room, and I thought, oh, what did I do now? Well, anyway, I reported to the orderly room, and first sergeant says, Trethel, I real nice told you, pack up your bags, you're being transferred. I said, what? What do you mean? By then I've been with people for well over 6 months. He gets his family. Well, anyway, he says, do you understand what I said? I said, yes, sir. I went back to my bags and I was transferred as a prison guard. Well, I presume it was because of my eyesight. So I bounced around the Army. And then after I was about a year as a prison guard, and these were all American prisoners, GIs who had screwed up one way or another, no foreign prisoners. And once again, I get a call, Tressel, pack up your bags. You're being transferred. Well, it turned out they were bringing troops back from Europe then the war was winding down in Europe, and they were transferring troops back to be retrained to go to Japan. And they says, you're gonna be working on troop trains as a cook. So I want to make a long story short. I ended up in a mess hall in California. Now remember, I'm 18, 19 years old, and of course I knew everything, And by the way, I found out how smart my mother and dad got between the time I was 18 and 21. But anyhow, I ended up as in a mess hall in San Francisco where the troops were coming back from the Pacific, and everybody got the first meal they got back in the United States was a steak, all the steak they wanted, and ice cream, milk, none of these things they had seen before. And it was a nice assignment there. Our troops were so happy to get back. Well, anyway, the mess sergeant, he looked at me, he looked at my records, he didn't know what to do with me, so he put me in charge. He figured there's no way I could screw up, but I fooled him. Similar to what the dudes on with coffee, they had these big coffee urns in each of the dining rooms. This was enormous. They fed 5,000 men a meal at this particular place. My job was to make the coffee, and I didn't drink coffee, so at the time, and so I had to get up like 2 hours before anybody else. But then I had to get up around 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, being the brilliant person that I was, I figured I'll make the coffee the night before. So I didn't have to get up. Well, that's what I said later on. I was told that I caused more casualties than the enemy. And one last point, thank you, Todd. The company I was with, I trained with in the Army, Company B, 393rd Regiment, was one of the first a part of the United States Army that was hit by the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge. And I read in a history book later on, many years later, that the company I was with had a 75% casualty rate the first 2 days of the battle. Killed, wounded, or captured. So how lucky could you be?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Speaking of the stories that we do at the Veterans Breakfast Club, we just had an event this morning. I welcome anybody who wants to hear stories like that. If you're a veteran, non-veteran, it doesn't matter. We'd love to have you at our events to listen and ask questions and meet the vets. And Joe was there this morning, and I saw him here today, and he's so hard to work like one-handed. Okay, there we go. So thank you, Joe. Everybody's welcome to our events. But I'm here to talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion, which is something that people in this part of the world know a lot about. And I think that there are people in this room that will know a heck of a lot more than I do about the Whiskey Rebellion, especially about the details of who was involved and what locations were involved here. We know about the Whiskey Rebellion because the most dramatic events of the rebellion happened 1 week from now, in July, 230 years ago, in 1794. And we know those events, and we've told ourselves those stories. And so as a historian, I think the one thing that I could add, the value that I could add to the Whiskey Rebellion story is more an understanding of what it meant, what it signified for this young republic, because it was big. This was a big deal in the early republic. This was the first test for the new union created by the United States Constitution just a handful of years before. And Alexander Hamilton, our Secretary of State, was convinced that if the Whiskey Rebellion was not quelled, the Republic would fail. And so this was a very high stakes event. I believe the name Whiskey Rebellion was coined by Hamilton himself. And I think he coined it in order to diminish its significance, to reduce it. to this rebellion over whiskey. And of course, whiskey, the excise tax on whiskey that Secretary Hamilton instituted or had Congress institute on March 3rd, 1791, that was the flashpoint of the rebellion. But the tinder in the fuel was much bigger than that. And so I want to talk about what fed the rebellion and then how it unfolded, especially here in this region. And there are a few things I think you need to know first about the Whiskey Rebellion. Is number one, this was a rebellion of the West. And in 1791, the 1790s, the West was the Trans-Appalachian West. Anything west of the Appalachians. There were rebellions in every state west of the Appalachian, from New York all the way down to western Georgia. Everywhere, Westerners rebelled against the new excise tax on whiskey. Not just here in western Pennsylvania, although the most dramatic events, as I said, happened here in western PA. This was a broad-based movement that simmered for years and more than crossed the threshold into a secessionist movement from the Union. And it happened here in the West. We almost broke apart, not north-south, but east-west. And that break would have happened in 1794, 230 years ago, next week. The second thing you should know about the Whiskey Rebellion is it really was a conflict between what we could understand broadly as rich versus poor, but much more accurately is described as a conflict between debtors and creditors. This was an issue of land and an issue of money, finance. Money was a problem in the young republic. Money would be a problem in American history well into the 20th century. Money was currency, was a problem. And the problem was we didn't have much of it. We had a lot of depreciating banknotes, thousands of different banknotes that depreciated. Every bank, a business, every state, every county, a city, they could issue their own currency. And it was worth more where it was close to where it was issued than miles away. So this was unstable, depreciating, non-uniform currency that was regularly used. The only currency that was non-depreciating were Bank of the United States banknotes, and there were very few of them here in Western PA, and minted coinage, very few of that here in Western PA. And that meant that if you wanted to buy something durable, if you wanted to buy a piece of land, if you wanted to buy a mule or an expensive piece of farming equipment, and certainly if you wanted to pay your taxes, you had to find a way to get your hands on minted coinage from Philadelphia, or Bank of the United States banknotes, which was the bank, of course, founded by Alexander Hamilton. And those notes did not circulate far from the East Coast. They didn't make it across the Appalachian Mountains. So it was to get your hands on those notes, you had to borrow. And you borrowed it from those who had it. So there were a handful of creditors, and they were large landowners, they were large wealthy merchants, mostly in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, in the South, a little bit in Charleston. People like Robert Morris, very well-known financier. He would lend you all the banknotes you wanted at 10 to 12% interest. And so it was not an uncommon thing here in Western PA after the American Revolution, when it ended in 1783. It was not an uncommon thing for a bad harvest. But, if you're a farmer, I don't know how farmers do it. If you're a farmer, the only thing worse than a bad harvest is a good harvest. Because a good harvest means there's an abundance of what you've raised and the price goes down and you can't cover your expenses. This was a disaster, a very common disaster in Western PA. You have these farmers who had this land in Western Pennsylvania that was available. They borrowed money to buy it. They borrowed money for equipment. They borrowed money for mules. And then a bad harvest or a collapse in farm prices, and they find themselves in arrears. They find themselves behind on their taxes, and they find themselves evicted and in prison, in debtor's prison. 1/3 of all Western PA farmers, 1/3 in the 7 years after the American Revolution ended, lost all their land. 1/3. This was a region in crisis. It was not uncommon to be riding down the road and to see a heartrending scene of a family evicted from a farmhouse, all of their belongings being auctioned off while the head of the household languors in debtor's prison. That happened a lot here in Western PA. That's why this place was just ripe for rebellion. And there's a third thing contributing to the sense of frustration among the people here in Western PA, and that was that we felt, I say we felt hemmed in here. We had all this great Western land beyond, beyond the point, beyond where the head of the Ohio River, and it flows all the way to the Mississippi River, which then flows all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. This was such a rich opportunity for land development, for trade to Gulf of Mexico. If you can get your produce to the Gulf of Mexico, you're set. You can trade anywhere in the Caribbean. You can trade to Europe. It's getting it to the Gulf of Mexico that was the difficult thing. The problem in the West was that it was inhabited by Native Americans. And the Native Americans were not friendly. They tended to attack settlers who moved west. And because of that, the federal government tended to, and Alexander Hamilton very much discouraged any migration west of Pittsburgh. Very much discouraged. It didn't support settlers who did it. And the Native Americans out west, I think it's hard for us to think about, because Native Americans, and the genocide against Native Americans is one of the great crimes of human history. And so I think it's hard for us sometimes to appreciate what motivated Pittsburghers, Western Pennsylvanians, to kill Native Americans when they had the chance. And one of the motives was Native Americans, and this is not an exaggeration, they were acting as agents for the British Empire. They were being supplied, trained, and funded by the British Empire to fight American settlers. The British, who had promised to vacate the Northwest Territories, didn't after the American Revolution. They kept a presence there. They had intelligence officers here working with Native Americans to fight the young American Republic, to keep the American Republic contained along the east. And the Native Americans also then worked with the Spanish Empire that controlled what was called Spanish West Florida, what would later be called the Louisiana Purchase Territory, New Orleans. The Spanish had an influence that went up the Mississippi River. They too worked with Native Americans to contain and control Western settlement. And the Spanish Empire did not permit American settlers or American shippers to use the port at New Orleans to warehouse their goods and to sell their goods and ship it abroad. So Pittsburghers found themselves stymied here in Western Pennsylvania. They hit a wall as they moved west, and the West simply was not opening up. And the United States policy was to keep it closed, to avoid any further new war with the British or with the Spanish or with Native Americans. So it's in this larger context of debt, landlessness, frustrated ambition, that the Alexander Hamilton's whiskey or excise tax on whiskey riled up so many people west of the Alleghenies. This tax is, at first glance, a very simple thing to explain. It was our first excise tax in history. There was no income tax in the United States. That was banned by the Constitution. There were only customs duties on goods that were shipped in from overseas, and then occasional, very rare excise tax, a tax on anything produced domestically or sold or purchased domestically. In this case, it was whiskey. And here was the rule, the law. The law, which was passed by Congress March 3rd, 1791, simply stated this: if you produce whiskey, you will have to pay a 9-cent federal tax per gallon on what you produce. That was it. 9 cents a gallon. how do you figure out how much whiskey people are producing? Well, you do it by hiring revenue collectors, revenuers, tax agents who roam the countryside. They knock on doors of farmers or craftsmen. They say, do you have a still? Of course, you say no. They say, I'm going to look around. They look around, they find your still, and they check out your still, and they look at it, and they figure, okay, how much whiskey can this thing make in a year? And they'll look at it and they'll say, 50 gallons of whiskey, maybe. And you would be then taxed 50 gallons a year. That would be your tax. The problem was that farmers didn't distill whiskey year round. They distilled it mainly in the winter when they had time. I mean, these things weren't operating like professional distilleries, running at capacity. They were used occasionally and often, but occasionally. And the revenue inspectors were paid 1% of every tax they imposed. So that meant they had an incentive to overestimate. The tax had to be paid in Bank of the United States banknotes or mint and coinage. There was not much of that. So this is just a huge problem thrown in to Western PA. There was a workaround. There was a loophole, I should say. There was another way to do it. You could, instead of paying the 9 cent a gallon tax, you could pay a flat rate and produce as much whiskey as you wanted. Now that only made sense if you were producing hundreds or thousands of gallons a year, like George Washington, who was the largest whiskey distiller. I think certainly one of the largest in the United States. It was only for commercial distilleries that this makes sense. But if you had a large operation, I mean, if you were making hundreds of gallons a year, thousands of gallons a year, and selling the whiskey, then you could reduce your tax to like 4 cents a gallon. That was a good deal. And it was just so clearly unfair to most Western Pennsylvanians who saw this as a tax on the little guy and giving the big guy a break. It's an attempt to put the little producers out of business and favor the large distillers. That's how most Pittsburghers saw it. And whiskey was so important to this region, so important to this economy. And its importance lies in the geography of Western PA. If you've ever traveled from the turnpike, from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, you drive through a lot of mountains. And imagine going through those mountains over the Appalachians. Because we couldn't go west, Pittsburghers would have to sell their grain, the rye that they grew here, the wheat, occasionally corn. They would have to bundle this stuff up, thousands and thousands of pounds of grain, and somehow get it over the mountains to markets in Lancaster and Philadelphia. Much, much easier to take that 1,200 pounds of grain and distill it into 160 pounds of whiskey. That's all you're doing. That's all whiskey really does, is it just condenses grain. That's the whole purpose of it. It distills it into a liquid that can be easily transported, packed into barrels, put on mules, and then you make the 10 or 14-day trip across the Alleghenies, and you sell that whiskey that would sell here for 25 cents a gallon. You get to Philadelphia, you can sell that for $1 a gallon. And you get, again, specie, you get coinage, you get Bank of the United States banknotes for this. So this was a really, really important commodity for Western Pennsylvanians. It was their link to the Eastern economy, and it made Pittsburghers famous. I mean, truly, the country knew. People drank whiskey all the time. It's unbelievable how much whiskey people drank. Whiskey was invented by the Scots, Irish, and the English didn't make it. They had gin. Everybody drank whiskey except a few. Washington, he drank rum. Jefferson was a snob. He drank wine, but he didn't tell anybody about it. John Adams was a New Englander. They drank cider. But everybody else drank whiskey. I mean, a lot of it. And there were some teetotalers who didn't drink anything because they had this crazy idea that alcohol could kill you. But, the issue was that the alcohol would definitely kill you, but it took many years. The water would kill you in 3 days. So, you're better off drinking the whiskey. And the average American drank the equivalent of 3 shots of whiskey a day, 7 days a week. It's stunning how much they drank. It was a constant all day. You drank it all day. It was a good way to sanitize the water, put some whiskey in it, and drink it. This was vital to everyday life. And when I say every Western Pennsylvanian knew how to make it, I mean everybody. If you were age 9 or 10, you knew how to make whiskey. And it was not a simple process. It was an art and a mystery. It involves biology and chemistry and physics all wrapped into one. And man, you had to know how to do it because this was a lifeline for the whole region. Whiskey was so valued that it was used, and we've heard this many times, I'm sure, it was used as currency here in Western PA. And that's because of the currency shortage. There were banknotes, as I said, that circulated here west of the Appalachian Mountains, but they depreciated. And sometimes the issuers went out of business. Whiskey was good as gold. Whiskey was good. If you think about it, whiskey makes a very good non-depreciating currency. It gets better with age. It doesn't lose its value. It's easily quantified, and it's fairly easy to transport. And then you could always, ship it east and sell it there for the hard currency that you need. So it was very common. You would hire a preacher, pay him in whiskey. You would, hire a carpenter, pay him in whiskey. And whiskey was denominated into casks and barrels, so you knew exactly how much you were getting. And a lot of these whiskey barrels were much more appreciated than banknotes. So the reaction here to the excise tax of March 3rd, 1791 was immediate and swift. And it was simply the Western PA, Pennsylvanians got together, the leaders did, and they decided we're not going to pay it. Simple as that. They met here. This place, Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church is where they met. The association was called the Mingo Creek Association. The kind of rough, radical country farmers who met there, they decided they were going to, form this association. They were often called the Mingo Boys, the Mingo Creek Boys, the Mingo Creek Society. And they were used to this kind of vigilante behavior, that they were going to forbid anybody in the region from paying the taxes. And they were going to forbid anybody from collecting the taxes. So when the first revenue agent appeared, a poor guy named Robert Johnson, walking along Pigeon Creek in Washington County. He's walking along on September 6, 1791, and he's going to start collecting this tax. He's going to start inspecting farms for their spills. Poor guy's walking along, and a group of the Mingo Creek vigilantes show up. And you recognize them immediately because their faces are all blackened, which was not a racial thing. It went back to the Middle Ages in England, like Robin Hood. And they were wearing women's clothes. And they seized Robert Johnson. They shaved his head. They stripped him naked. They tarred and feathered him. They tied him loosely to a tree. The record says, we allowed him to escape, but they tied him to a tree. They took his horse. He escapes. He walks all the way to Washington and goes to a federal judge and says, can you imagine this guy, how he showed up? I know who these guys were. These were 16 of the Mingo Creek Boys. I know them by name. He identified every one. They had arrest warrants sent for these 16 Mingo Creek vigilantes. And the marshals went out to arrest them, and the marshals were stripped naked and tied to a tree. This vigilantism, the Mingo Creek Association, they had been doing this since the end of the Revolution, fighting evictions. fighting, getting people out of debtor's prison. That's what they had existed for. They were a ready-made vigilante organization, just ready to resist the excise tax on whiskey. And how these movements worked, and I think they still work that way today in different forms, is this is how the American Revolution worked. This was a lesson learned in the American Revolution, that you have to have a two-pronged attack when you're fighting an enemy like the British Empire. You have to have the wacko vigilantes who dress like women and tar and feather people. During the American Revolution, they were called the Sons of Liberty. And then you have to have the officials, the above the fray kind of people, the people who hold meetings and they keep records, and they write petitions and they sign documents and they do diplomacy. That was what we called the Continental Congress. And both of those two wings of the movement have to act together. The vigilantes lend leverage to the Continental Congress, and the Continental Congress lends legitimacy to the vigilantes. And that's exactly how it happened here in Western PA. You had the Mingo Creek Association, they were the Sons of Liberty, they were the vigilantes. And then you had these official conventions, they were called. They went by different names. There were 3 of them held between July and September 1791. They were held in Brownsville, PA, in Washington, PA, and in Pittsburgh. And in Pittsburgh, they were held at an inn called the Sign of the Green Tree Inn, or Tavern, which was right where Fort Pitt Boulevard is today. Right at this location. I grabbed this Google map image here. And this is where they formed a petition. They made their demands. They sent their demands to the State House. They sent it to the House of Representatives, and they sent it to the President of the United States, the White House, George Washington. And the people who drafted the these petitions, these were respected people. These weren't Yahoo vigilantes, They were William Finley. William Finley represented the 11th U.S. Congressional District here in Western PA. That district went all the way from Erie to the Maryland border. He was a representative, the congressman here. Very much a Jeffersonian. Very radical Jeffersonian. We might call him, he was a populist left-winger. We had Albert Gallatin, another fascinating devotee to Thomas Jefferson, Swiss-born. He had served in the PA Assembly. He very radical populist also. He had been elected U.S. Senator, and the U.S. Senate refused to seat him because he was born in Switzerland, had been naturalized. And then there's this interesting guy, Hugh Henry Brackenwood, which you've probably heard of. He is renowned as the founder of the University of Pittsburgh, the founder of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, a writer of novels, and an attorney. And he was a kind of a man of parts. He had come from the East. He had seen that there was opportunity here in the West. He settled in Pittsburgh when Pittsburgh was a town of maybe 400 or 500 people. And these men together, they fashioned this petition. They sent it off to the nation's capital, which is Philadelphia, and they got a response. And the response was, well, we'll reduce the tax by 1 cent. And that was not good enough. And what happens is, if the official wing of the movement does not get the response that the movement requires, then the power tends to shift to the vigilantes, to the radicals. And that's exactly what happened. When they got the response from Philadelphia, William Finley, very disappointed. The Constitution is new. The Constitution had just been ratified. There was a lot that Americans didn't understand or know about this new government. So, for example, Thomas Mifflin, the governor of Pennsylvania, was convinced, absolutely convinced, that any state could nullify any federal law that it disagreed with. Absolutely. Every Pittsburgher believed that. It was called nullification. Many of you might be old enough to remember when nullification was an argument used by segregationists in the South during the Civil Rights Movement to nullify federal civil rights laws. Well, That nullification theory had a long history that went back to Western Pennsylvania. And William Finley was a nullifier. He believed that states should have the right to, to declare null and void any congressional law that they disagreed with. So, being so disappointed in the official petition, another convention was held. This was in the summer of 1792. This was not led by Finley and the rest. Rather, it was led by this guy, a well-known, very radical attorney who lived in Washington County named David Bradford.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we know him, David Bradford. Yeah, there's a Bradford House, a well-known character. There's a Bradford House right there. And it is the Bradfords, it was David Bradford who declared that this, with the response from Philadelphia, Bradford and the Mingo Creek Association would seize this territory, that the federal government would stop operating here in Western PA until it was settled. That meant the federal courts, any federal courts, had to be shut down. The post offices were shut down. There were 2 Army forts here in Pittsburgh. They were going to be shut down. That was the idea. That the Mingo Creek Association was going to function. No taxes would be collected whatsoever. This is a crazy cartoon that I don't totally understand. But here's an excise tax collector who just collected whiskey from these guys. These guys want to tar and feather him. He wants to hand the whiskey over to his rich buddies, but the devil gets them and then roasts them over a fire. I don't understand that. But in 1792, I mean, so here you have a situation. This law was passed in March 1791. 1792 comes to an end, 1793. No tax is collected at all in Western PA, not a cent. And it was well known, and it was announced, in Pittsburgh that anybody who tried to collect the tax would be tarred and feathered. Anybody who rented any space to any federal official would have their space or building destroyed. And any resident who agreed to even have their still inspected would receive a visit from Tom the Tinker. Tom the Tinker. Tom the Tinker was like Robin Hood. He was everybody, he was nobody, It was a nom de guerre. The joke was this: a tinker was an itinerant repairman who would repair machinery and things. So Tom the Tinker would show up on your farm and repair your still by putting bullet holes in it. That was the idea. And there were many bullet holes. Anybody who seemed to be willing to cooperate with the federal government in the revenue collection, they were attacked. So for years, this tax, not a single cent was ever collected, and hardly a cent was collected west of the Appalachian Mountains anywhere in the United States because of similar activities elsewhere from New York all the way down to Georgia. And I think we would not be here talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. We would not remember the Whiskey Rebellion. The Western PA would not be distinct from Western Carolina in terms of the Whiskey Rebellion, if not for this guy, John Neville. John Neville, and I would love to have somebody explain to me what John Neville's motives were. John Neville got it into his craw that he was going to absolutely make sure that the tax was collected. He was going to be a one-man anti-vigilante crew. And he got himself declared the tax inspector for the region. And he was going to start going around and inspecting stills. This is John Neville, the richest man west of the Appalachian Mountains. He's one of the richest men in America. I really would argue he was probably wealthier than anybody who lived in the Trans-Appalachian West. Certainly by far the richest man in this area. He had not one house but 2, one on Bower Hill, one where Pittsburgh is today. He had not 1 or 2 or 3 businesses. He had many. You name it, he made it. He had a glass blowing operation, a pottery operation, brick making, Whiskey, of course, a lot of it. Iron Forge. He grew a lot of wheat, a lot of rye, by far the largest distiller in the region. In a region where there weren't many enslaved people at all. He had a lot of them. He had dozens and dozens of slaves at Bower Hill, his 10,000-acre plantation. And he had things that nobody else even dreamed of. Nobody here had ever seen. His house in Bower Hill, they had rugs, windows, plaster. Nobody in Pittsburgh ever saw those things, you know? I mean, it was like a finished house in the East. He was living a whole different life. Fascinating guy. He comes from an old Virginia family. He had moved to Western PA because of the business opportunity here. He had served with George Washington during the American Revolution. He served in the French and Indian War. And he had a network that was called the Neville Connection. It was like the Neville family network. Everybody who was anybody was related to John Neville. So his brother-in-law was Abraham Kirkpatrick, who was in charge of the supply operation at these two forts. The great American federal presence in Pittsburgh was soggy old Fort Pitt and the brand new Fort Fayette, which was nice and dry and much better, but smaller. These two forts were still in operation in the 1790s. Abraham Kirkpatrick was an Army officer who was in charge of the supply of both of them. He bought everything from Neville that the Army needed. Neville's son-in-law was Isaac Craig, who was in charge of the commissary. He bought everything from Neville. And Neville sold anybody who was moving down the Ohio River. Neville would give them all the equipment and all the supplies they would need to start a new life out west. And John Neville announced that he was going to start collecting this tax. His friend Alexander Hamilton helped him out, sent him an aide, a federal marshal named David Lennox from Philadelphia. David Lennox arrived in 1794, in June 1794, with 60 subpoenas. They were called writs, 60 of them, naming 60 people who had openly defied the collection of the excise tax on whiskey. They were going to be issued a subpoena, which was ordering them to appear in court in Philadelphia, 300 miles away, where they were going to be fined $250, which was over 10 times the average annual income of a Western PA person. So the two of them, John Neville, David Lennox, started riding through the countryside to deliver these 60 subpoenas, these writs. And the very first place they went to was the homestead of a guy named William Miller. It is now the site of the Oliver Miller homestead. Oliver Miller was William Miller's father, who founded the homestead. William Miller was on the list. He had a writ. He had a subpoena. He had defied the tax. Strange. Really a strange. William Miller was related by marriage to John Neville. and he did business with Neville. And so Lennox and Neville show up at the Miller homestead, and they say, we have this subpoena we're going to issue to William Miller. Miller was out in the field. Somebody called him. He came out. And he gets into an argument with Lennox and Neville and says, what the hell are you doing? Why are you picking on me with this subpoena? I didn't pay. I'm happy to pay the whiskey excise tax. I'm on your side. I'm moving to Kentucky. That's why I didn't pay it. I didn't think I had to pay it. I mean, I'm halfway packed for Kentucky. They get into this argument. They're going back and forth. And as they're arguing, shots fire over the heads of Neville and Lennox. And it's coming from the wood line, the tree line, next to the William Miller homestead. If you go there next week to the Oliver Miller homestead, they do a whole reenactment of this. It's fantastic. It's a lot of fun because it really is a funny scene. And it's a lot of fun to see it played out at this house that is a recreation of the building that was on the site when John Neville and David Lennox arrived on July 15th, 1794. And as you'll see, as they're arguing, they have this funny argument back and forth. Like, come on, man, don't tax me. Shots ring out over Lennox and Neville. And Lennox and Neville kind of duck around. They look at the tree line. And they see where there are guys lined up. And the tree line shooting at them. And the guys start shouting at them. And Lennox says something like, don't be cowards and hide behind the tree. Come show yourself, show the courage to show yourself. So they do. They come out from the tree line. They show themselves. And they shout at him again, like a lot. And Lennox says, what did you say? I can't understand what you're saying. And they get closer and they shout it again. Lennox would later testify, and I love this episode because Lennox would later testify, the accents here are so thick and heavy, people are impossible to understand. This is the first recorded episode of a Pittsburgh accent. They could not communicate. The Mingo Creek boys fire again over the heads of Lennox and Neville. Lennox and Neville get back on the horses and they flee. And they go back to where they go back to Bower Hill, to John Neville's house. So the Mingo Creek boys have a very quick meeting and they decide that they're going to send a delegation of 50. And they want the surrender of David Lennox, who is here illegally, representing a federal government that is no longer recognized here in Western PA. They figure that he's being holed up in Bower Hill, the mansion, which is right where like Providence Point and the JCC, St. Thomas More are. The Mingo Creek boys, 50 of them, marched to the house and they announced, we want you to surrender, David Lennox. It turns out Lennox wasn't there, but Neville was. Neville and his wife and a granddaughter and maybe his wife's friend. That was it. And this is often written about because it is such a remarkable thing. You have 50 tough men laying siege to a house, 50 of them demanding the surrender. Neville fights back. His wife loads the muskets. He moves from window to window and fires out the windows. He hits four guys, including Oliver Miller, who is the young Oliver Miller, William Miller's nephew, kills him. And the 50 Mingo Creek boys flee. They retreat. One guy held off these 50. The wife kept reloading. He kept going from window to window to make people think that there were more people in the house than there were. And I just think this is a digression, but I think this is important to understand the context here. Pittsburghers were used to defending. They had every Western Pennsylvania had a system for the family to defend their house from Indian attack. It was like a duck and cover exercise. You reload, I go to this window, I go to that window. So this was something that the family had rehearsed many, many times. Americans didn't lay siege to buildings very often, so the Mingo Creek boys didn't quite know how to do that. The Mingo Creek boys retreated. They got intelligence that the army had now occupied Bower Hill, and so they were going to have to take Bower Hill by force. They marched 600 strong back to Bower Hill after having a meeting at Couch's Fort on Fort Couch Road. It is now where the McDonald's is. Some of you may be old enough to remember before McDonald's, there was something called the Pioneer Inn. Even I'm old enough to remember the Pioneer Inn. The Pioneer Inn was built on the foundation of Couch's Fort, which was a fort to protect residents from Native American attack. There was a great stone fireplace in the Pioneer Inn that was one of the walls of the fort. And the Pioneer Inn was finally demolished in the 70s, or maybe it made it to the 80s before it was demolished and McDonald replaced it. That was an important meeting spot in the Whiskey Rebellion. The Mingo Creek boys met there. They decided to put a call out for men who could come and seize Bower Hill. The idea was that they would demand the 60 subpoenas and they wanted the resignation of John Neville. So 600 marched from McDonald's all the way to the JCC on Payne Boulevard, and they arrived. They arrived in the evening, and they surrounded Bower Hill, and they demanded that John Neville surrender. Some shots were fired out the windows. A white flag was then flown out of a window of Bower Hill. And so the leader of the 600 men, James McFarland, who is the brother of the guy McFarland Road was named after, James McFarland had been a major in the American Revolution. He was a well-known former officer in the Continental Army. James McFarland stepped out behind a tree to do the parley or some kind of peace negotiation and was shot dead. And that's when the 600 militiamen just erupted in fury. And they lit fire to every structure except the slave quarters at Bower Hill. Burned Bower Hill to the ground, burned everything that they could to the ground. Some enslaved people had been armed and were fighting with Neville. They gave up and they came out and said, hey, could you spare our houses? and the rebels did spare. This was the turning point. This was the dramatic event of the Whiskey Rebellion. It happened on July 17, 1794. 5 days later, there was a follow-up meeting at the Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church. It's presided over by David Bradford. Essentially, what the Mingo Creek Association decides is they are now taking the first steps to secede from the Union. They are going to make contact with emissaries from the Spanish Empire, from the British Empire, from Western Virginia, from Western Carolina, and from Western New York. And they're going to try to create a cooperative defensive alliance that will protect them from the new Republic of the United States of America. They considered calling it Westsylvania. This was secession. This was something that they felt that they were absolutely entitled to do. Hugh Henry Brackenridge was at this meeting, and he was alarmed. He's an educated attorney. And he said to Bradford and to the group, do you know what you're doing? This is not something you fool with. The Congress passed a law in 1792. It was called the Militia Act. That means that Congress has the right to federalize state militias to occupy Western PA and declare martial law. Because Pittsburgh thought the United States Army is so small, so small. You can march the entire army here and we can defeat them. They didn't know that New Jersey militia, Maryland militia, Virginia militia could all be federalized, called up. The president of the United States, the commander-in-chief, could be put in charge of them and effectively use them to take back Western PA. Bradford was shaken, I think, by what Hugh Henry Brackenridge had to say, but he followed through with this plan. And the plan was, our first step in secession is we have to take Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was seen as the seat, if there was one, of federal power in Western PA. It's where the two forts were. It's where the post office was. There was a court that sometimes held session that had federal associations. That's what, the people who lived in Pittsburgh, and there were only 1,000 of them, who lived in the city of Pittsburgh. There were 10,000 people who lived in the county of what we would call Allegheny County, or this whole area, this whole region. But only 1,000 in Pittsburgh. Those Pittsburghers, they were the suspects. They were the ones who had federal sympathies. They liked Hamilton a little bit because they bought and sold, they sold to the army. They had these connections with the federal government. So what we have to do is we have to march on Pittsburgh and take Pittsburgh, seize the forts, and then start building our new republic. So the call was by Bradford, all able-bodied men in Western PA, we should meet in Braddock's Field on August 1st to march on Pittsburgh. And they did. 7,000 people. Think about this. This is a region of maybe 12,000 residents. 7,000 men assemble in Braddock's Field. Many of them came from elsewhere. You know, they had heard about it and they wanted to come and support Western Pennsylvanians. They brought provisions for 4 days. They brought their weapons and they were mustered and they were drilling. And David Bradford showed up. He had went to a tailor before this and gotten a whole new white uniform created. And he rode a white horse. And people were calling him the Robespierre of Pittsburgh. Robespierre, the autocrat in the French Revolution, the dictator who had taken over after the French Revolution, very radical in Paris. Well, David Bradford was the Pittsburgh incarnation of Robespierre. And then there was all talk about what they would do. They would go into Pittsburgh. I hear there's gold buried under the fort. They were going to fashion a guillotine, start chopping heads. And a lot of radical talk, a lot of big talk. Hugh Henry Brackenridge, he's kind of the hero of the day. He really was with Bradford the entire time. It was like good cop, bad cop. Bradford would stir up the troops, and Hugh Henry Brackenridge would go and say, you know what? I hear the Pittsburghers are really sympathetic with the movement. I hear they might have food for us when we get there. I think they're on our side. He rushed down into Pittsburgh. He warned Pittsburghers, bury whatever valuables you have, lock your doors, close your shops, bring out all your whiskey. He planned this. Bring out all your food, all your provisions, set it up, welcome us into Pittsburgh so they don't burn the city down. And so the procession began down 8 or 9 miles down from Braddock's Field, Braddock, where Braddock is today, down Braddock's Road into Pittsburgh. You have to picture, these are 5,000-7,000 guys marching over 2 or 3 miles down this hot day in August. They arrive, they come down from Braddock's Road down to 4th Avenue. And Hugh Henry Brackenridge is leading the group, leading the procession. Mm-hmm. And he makes a critical move right here. Instead of turning right down Wood Street and going to Fort Fayette, where the gold was buried and where they could, actually maybe fight some federal troops, he leads them left down Market Street, then left again down what was called Water Street, which is where the Parkway is today. And he leads them to this open field where the jail is, the county jail is today. And in the open field are tables of food and barrels of whiskey. And these guys are hot and they're tired and they have all the whiskey and there's a band playing for them. They are being entertained and given as much whiskey as they want. And then there are all of these boats, these ferries, lined up along the Monongahela River that are offering these guys free transportation across the river so they can go back home. And these drunken guys stumble on the boats. They are taken across the river. And the order of the day is, when you're a ferry, you go across, you come immediately back, empty, so that nobody can return in your boat. And over the course of 12 or 15 hours, almost all of the rebels were transported to the other side of the river, and Pittsburgh was saved. And Hugh Henry Brackenridge really deserves some credit for saving Pittsburgh that day. The word about what happened at Bower Hill, the Battle of Bower Hill, the word about the muster at Braddock's Field reached Philadelphia and reached the ears of the President George Washington, and he was incensed, absolutely incensed. He was egged on by his beloved Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, whom he treated like a son. And Hamilton convinced the president, we have to march on Pittsburgh and impose martial law. This is a test of the Republic. This is a test of everything that we stand for. If we allow Western PA to break away, this rebellion to succeed, we've lost what we created in the Constitutional Convention. So George Washington federalized the militia from New Jersey, from Maryland, from Virginia, and from Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania, and marched 13,000 troops west. He put Light Horse Harry Lee in charge of the southern contingent from Virginia and Maryland, and he put General Hamilton in charge of the northern contingent, which marched to Bedford. Washington himself, President of the United States, rode at the head of this 13,000-man army. Washington went as far as Bedford, and then he said goodbye and went back. Alexander Hamilton took them the rest of the way. The two wings of the army met in McKeesport, and they entered Pittsburgh together in the first week of November 1794, and they declared martial law. And Pittsburgh was under martial law for months. The rebels had fled. Most of the leaders had fled. They knew the army was coming, and so they knew their names were on lists, and Hamilton came with a list, at least 500 people. He wanted big shots. He wanted Bradford badly, but he also wanted Breckinridge. He wanted William Finley, a Jeffersonian he hated. He wanted some of the leaders of the movement. David Bradford had fled. Many others, thousands of others, had fled down the Ohio River. Most of them stopped in Kentucky. Some of them went farther, all the way to Mississippi. And so when Hamilton, who was in charge of this operation, he stayed in Pittsburgh for weeks to lead the martial law effort here in Pittsburgh. He used this list. I think by this time it had been whittled down to, he identified 300 people he wanted to have arrested. They were rounded up at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. On the night of November 11th, 1794. Pittsburghers would remember it as the dreadful night. And I have seen, there's a novel about it. I don't necessarily recommend that you read it, but it's a novel about this night. It's a really good historical record of this event, because this event would live on in Pittsburgh collective memory for generations. I mean, if you had grandparents who lived in Pittsburgh at the turn of the 20th century, they knew, if you said dreadful night to them, they would know what you're talking about. If you said Alexander Hamilton to them, they would slap your face. I mean, he was absolutely public enemy number one here in Western PA for generations after this. 300 supposed rebels were rounded up. You can imagine the scenes. They're dragged out of bed. They don't have their boots on. There's sleet. It's raining. Children are crying. Wives are weeping. And these men are dragged out and they're put into pens or they're put into basements for several days. And then they're taken one by one to a promptu federal court, a judge named Peters, who starts hearing the cases. And all he's trying to do is, his orders are from Hamilton. We need to transfer these people to Philadelphia for trial. Peter says, on what evidence and on what charges? And Hamilton says, treason. What evidence do you have? There was no evidence for these people. So Peters would bring these people up. He would say, why are you here? They would say, I don't know. They would interrogate somebody who represented the federal government. He was a rebel. What evidence do you have? Well, we don't really have any. And Peters just let them all go, one after the other, all released. Finally, Hamilton had made some kind of deal with Peters. He said, look, man, you got to give me 20. I don't care which 20, just pick 20. I need to bring prisoners back to Philadelphia to tie this thing up. So Peters did. He delivered 20 that would be marched, and they were marched all the way in December 1794 across the state to Philadelphia. They were marched into Philadelphia on Christmas Day, 1794. All of Philadelphia, and we've hated Philadelphia ever since, all of Philadelphia came out to see these ragged, poor rebels, poorly shod, freezing, marched into Philadelphia, right to Congress Hall, which is in the Independence Hall complex. George Washington himself came out to review them. And these people were put into a jail, and then they were reviewed by a grand jury. As you'll see, 8 of the 20 were immediately dismissed. The charges were immediate. There's no evidence against you for anything. 12 stood trial, actually went through a trial. 10 of those were found not guilty. 2, John Mitchell and Philip Wiggle, or Weigel, Wiggle, were found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. Their sentence was commuted or pardoned by George Washington. And that's why Wiggle whiskey is called Wiggle whiskey, named after Philip Weigel or Wiggle. And that's why their logo here is the fraying noose. He escaped death. So John Mitchell and Philip Weigel were able to walk back to Pittsburgh and start their lives back up again. The whole Whiskey Rebellion kind of ended with a whimper instead of a bang. That was kind of the end of it. But I think the postscript to the rebellion is as interesting as and as important as the rebellion itself. Because it just is like one of these amazing accidents of history that almost immediately after the rebellion, things got better in Western PA. A lot better. First of all, the occupation of Pittsburgh lasted so long that you had 1,500 federal troops living in Pittsburgh, and they get paid with hard currency, Bank of the United States banknotes. So now we have the currency we need here in Western Pennsylvania. The military occupation was actually good for the Western Pennsylvania economy. Then word comes that Mad Anthony Wayne had won this great victory against Native Americans in the Ohio country in Toledo, called the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Ohio was now opened up. Settlers could move west. And not only that, but J. Pinckney, Secretary of State, had negotiated a treaty with the Spanish Empire allowing Americans to ship their goods to New Orleans and store it in warehouses there and ship to the Gulf of Mexico. It was like rainbows and unicorns suddenly. And to make the whole thing even better, in 1800, the Whiskey Rebels' hero, godlike hero, ran for president and won, Thomas Jefferson. Here are the election results. In Allegheny County, in 1800, Thomas Jefferson won 100% of the vote. Wow. In Westmoreland County, he only won 90% of the vote. I mean, that's how popular Jefferson was, and of course, how unpopular John Adams was. David Bradford would flee down to Louisiana, start a new life there. John Adams would pardon him. Hugh Henry Brackenridge would also escape arrest. He would go on to become a Pennsylvania Supreme Court justice. William Finley would continue serving in the House of Representatives for 23 more years. A very long-serving, our first congressman here in Western PA, and would remain a loyal Jeffersonian throughout his life. Albert Gallatin had the best revenge. Jefferson appointed him his Secretary of State, and Albert Gallatin would be the Secretary of State for 16 years. Wow. 2 of Jefferson's terms, 2 of Madison's terms. John Neville never rebuilt Bower Hill. Instead, he bought an island called Montour Island from a guy named Montour, who was an Indian scout, and he was part Native American. We all know the name of that island, Neville Island. And John Neville lived the rest of his life on Neville Island. So it's remarkable how the conditions that fed the Whiskey Rebellion are all ameliorated very shortly after the dramatic events that took place here. And that's why the nation didn't split because of it. Thank you for your patience. I want to invite James Stokowski to come up here. He's this wonderful painter who painted this picture. James, thank you for coming here. Thank you for bringing this. James is a world-renowned, I mean, he's not going to say this, but I'm going to say it. And Roxanne, if you'd like to introduce him or add, a world-renowned painter. You live in Washington County. You paint in Washington County. His landscapes are known throughout the world. He spent a lot of time researching the Whiskey Rebellion. I think you did this for a commission?
No, it's not.
It's not commission?
Something I wanted to do. I'm fascinated.
Oh, good, thank you.
Oh, thanks. No, I'm fascinated by our local history. And this is a scene that no artist seems to have painted, in the last 200 years. And these are guys making whiskey. This still is from the Oliver Miller homestead. This is the original still that if you go to, you'll see that. You have a picture of it.
Yeah.
It's all black right now.
Right.
This is what it probably looked like. Right. So I met with historians, read a couple of books, and then I met with these reenactors, and boy, they really got into it. They just loved doing this. So I posed them, and I developed this painting. So, just something I want to do. I want to do a series on this. Like, you have a engraving of a tar and feather, but nobody ever painted that. So I have these guys pose for me. I'm going to do that one next. And the reenactors are the real experts. I mean, I could talk about all the, supposedly important historical stuff, but if you want to know what they wore, what they smelled like, what they looked like, how they talked, you talk to reenactors. They know all that stuff. They really get into it.
Yeah, that's terrific. And you have this wonderful print. I mean, this is not like a normal print. This is very vivid in color. I think you said, I don't know nothing about
a special process.
A special process.
It's like an 8-color instead of 4-color offset. So I have a printer in Washington. So he matches the original very faithfully.
Yeah. So I think you sell prints, and if people want to talk to
this, if anybody's interested.
And if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Oh, you can go to my website.
If you can spell Solkowski.
Yeah.
Solkowski.com.
Okay. If you want to email me, I can put you in touch with James. If you want to talk to him more about his wonderful art, and especially this painting and the print.
Yeah, and has anybody been to the Bradford House, the educational building they have? Well, they have these prints for sale over there.
Oh, okay.
That'll help them raise some money.
I'm
You asked if I wanted to add.
Yeah.
His paintings are in public and private collections across the country and around the world, and even in the presidential library in Texas, the Bush Presidential Library.
amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. I know that Sydney here is freaking out because the library closes at 8 o'clock. So it's only 13 minutes from now. So if we have some comments or questions, if anybody wants, yes. The Neville homestead was John Neville's son's house, right? Presley Neville's house. And John Neville never lived there, but Presley Neville did. And John Neville, when he fled, I think on July 15th, that's where he fled. He fled to Presley Neville's house. Yes.
My question is, when do you come back again?
Yeah. I'll be back for December.
It is the first Thursday in December, and that will be the World War I Christmas truce talk.
That's a great story. Such an important story. The Christmas truce. This was a truce in December 1914 during the worst war in human history up to that time. It really did happen, where they stopped shooting for Christmas Day and they met in no man's land and shook hands and buried dead. And I think it's a wonderful story to share. Thank you very much for your patience.